I have always been a huge fan of Bloodlands builds, but until this season, I never felt like it was a top tier build. And I really didn't think it would be this season either, but look at these clips on the screen. This Duriel kill, back-to-back 40 mils. I killed him in just like 3 seconds. Look at the AoE damage when I'm pulling elites like in the vaults at the end with all these elites. Look at how good Bloodlands is at dealing with that. And on top of those two things, Bloodlands is still an incredibly tanky build. Overall, this build is insanely strong, and it's way better than I expected, just like so many other builds this season. The only downside of Bloodlands is it does have that slower ramp time for AoE, that other builds can get the damage out a lot faster. What you're going to see as we get into the build, that a lot of the build is predicated around the faster ramp, and we solve this problem to a decent degree. So let's get into the build and start talking about how it works and how it's able to do so much damage while being so tanky. It's very hard to talk about Bloodlands without bringing up our new unique. This unique is actually very powerful, though it has some severe drawbacks. So first, let's talk about why it's so good. So the effect is effectively going to fortify us for 2% of our maximum life every single time we cast the Bloodlands, and on top of that, it's also going to give us a 5% chance to spawn a Blood Orb. That's incredibly strong, and to top it off, it's also going to give our Bloodlands a 20% damage multiplier. Now, this fortified generation ends up being very important because it allows us to change some Paragon nodes around, giving us a lot more damage. So this chest piece ends up being a lot more than 20% damage while giving us a nice tankiness buff. So why is it not that good? Well, there's two main reasons why it's not that good. The first is that we're already wanting to run Harlequin and Blood Moon Breaches. We'll get into why in a minute. But the result is that we're running 3 uniques, so we don't actually have a slot for a defensive aspect. This is a big problem because Juggernaut is so important. On top of that, Mutilator Plate has 2 very weak stats in the form of Willpower and Healing Received. Both of those stats are not useful. So we end up just having total armor and maximum life on our chest piece. So what do we have to do to compensate? Well, without having Juggernaut, it becomes very important to get a very good total armor roll on your Mutilator Plate, which you can see I do not have, which is a big deal. But it also becomes extremely important to get a good percent armor roll on your necklace. You can see it can roll up to a 30% total armor. That is a ton. And between the total armor on Mutilator Plate and the total armor on our necklace, we can start to get closer but can't quite reach armor cap. But luckily, because of our pet and because of some of the other stuff we're running, we can still be tanky enough to do Nightmare 100. So this chest piece is great, but it has some downsides, but because we're able to play around them, this ends up being very powerful. If you were paying attention to this build, you might have noticed something very odd, which is that I'm actually running skulls in my jewelry, which means I'm not getting resistances, but you can see despite that, I'm still hitting res cap. This is because we're getting a ton of resistances from our Paragon board, and we need the armor very badly. So we can actually get away with running 250 armor gems in all of our jewelry for a total of 750 armor. This ends up being very powerful, as you can imagine, especially when you're severely below armor cap. On top of that, this build is able to scale very well with Lidless Wall, and this will give us a nice crit chance and damage reduction increase because of the uptime on Bone Storm, and it's also going to give us a nice flat value armor. You can see even on an 852 Lidless Wall, I'm getting 658 armor, and it's going to give us a chance to block on hit to reduce incoming damage. The survivability increase from Lidless Wall is quite incredible, and I highly recommend that you run this if you're having any survivability issues at all. Now let's talk about the changes I made for the bossing setup where you saw me absolutely annihilate Duriel. So I swapped my weapons to the Grandfather because it is like the biggest damage multiplier that we can get on a weapon, but the main idea of what we're going for here is we want to replace the extra blood lances with just extra flat damage. So if you don't have a Grandfather, don't worry. Just run the attack speed aspect, and then in your offhand, run an aspect that gives you a damage multiplier, such as the Edge Master's aspect. And this is the thing, we're actually going to be equipping the Banished Lord's Talisman for bossing because the damage increase is so tremendous. So then on the offhand, you can run the aspect of Grasping Veins. So then we're adding an Edge Masters, adding an aspect of Grasping Veins, and then finally on the ring, we're adding the aspect of Untimely Death in place of the Starless Skies. And these changes are going to ludicrously increase our damage, and it's going to reduce their AoE, but for bossing it obviously doesn't matter, so that's why we're making those changes. Let's move on to the skill tree and start talking about the real core of how this build works. You can see how the gear is giving us tons of damage, tons of survivability, loads of blood lances, but why is all this so important? So, we're going to be running Reap with Acolyte's Reap, guaranteed corpse generation, massive essence, attack speed. This basic skill does everything. Then we're going to be running Bloodlance. So, Bloodlance is a very important piece of the build, and a huge reason why the attack speed is so important is because of supernatural Bloodlance. So every 6th cast of Bloodlance is a guaranteed overpower, and it's going to spawn a Blood Orb. So remember, with Gore Quills, that Blood Orb is going to automatically get consumed by us, and then we're going to auto-cast an extra Bloodlance the next time we Bloodlance, and the Orb will heal us and everything else, plus it's the guaranteed overpower. So we want to attack as many times per second. On top of this, whenever we hit an enemy, the Bloodlance will linger in them, and then whenever we attack with Bloodlance, all the enemies that already have a lance in them will get hit. So it becomes very important to get a ton of attack speed and a ton of blood lances out so you can lance as many enemies as possible so that your overpower hits cleave and kill everything. And you can see in the bossing setup, we don't need all that cleave anymore, we just need as much damage as possible. But in the AoE setup, we want to get as many lances out as we can, as fast as we can, for that massive AoE damage. So, we're also going to be putting 1 point into Unliving Energy and 3 points into Imperfectly Balanced for the damage multiplier. We can easily afford the extra cost. We're also running Corpse Explosion, going to Blinded Corpse Explosion, mostly actually just to proc Reaper's Pursuit for the increased movement speed, but it's also going to proc a couple of other effects that we'll talk about. We're putting 3 points into Death's Embrace for the damage multiplier as well as survivability, 3 points into Amplify Damage for the damage increase, and then we're taking Decrepify down to a point Decrepify. We don't really need the cooldown reduction, it's more of a convenience so that we can get better uptime on Bone Storm. But remember, because of the Lidless Wall, we're going to get really high uptime on Bone Storm anyway, but this is just going to help kind of bridge the gap whenever you have downtime. 3 points into Reaper's Pursuit, as we already discussed, 1 point into Gruesome Mending, 3 points into Coalesced Blood. Coalesced Blood is an 18% damage multiplier, which is pretty insane. 3 points into Drain Vitality for a chance to Fortify on hit, which will help us keep and maintain our Fortify cap, which is very important for both damage reduction and the overpower damage, remember, because we're going to get more damage the more Fortify we have, so it's important to stay capped. In that vein, we're also running Transfusion, which will give our Bloodlance a chance to spawn a Blood Orb, which will give us healing, and it's also going to give us an extra Bloodlance because of the Gore Quills aspect. And finally, we're running Tides of Blood for a 30% damage multiplier on overpower, which is pretty wild. We're also going to be running Corpse Tendrils, and we're running Blighted Corpse Tendrils in this build for the Blood Orb generation. As we've already discussed, Blood Orb's very important, and this is going to give us a nice little damage buff. We're putting 3 points into Inspiring Leader for the 12% attack speed. Of course, attack speed is very important for the ramp time, but also for the damage, because remember, the faster we attack, the more overpowers we get. We're taking Bone Storm, and we're taking Prime Bone Storm and Supreme Bone Storm for the damage reduction and the crit chance. 3 points into Standalone for the damage reduction, 3 points in Momentum Mori to buff the Book of the Dead, which we'll talk about here in a second. And then we're also taking Rathman's Vigor. So Rathman's Vigor starts to become clear why these Blood Orbs are so important. So every 12 seconds we get a guaranteed overpower, and then based on how much healing we receive from Blood Orbs, we reduce the cooldown from 12 seconds down to pretty low actually with enough Blood Orb generation. So you can start to see why we're generating so much Blood Orbs and why it's so important to run Gore Quills to suck all those Blood Orbs up and quickly proc this, keep us fully healthy, and everything else. You can start to see how the engine of this build is working. So let's talk about the Book of the Dead. We're going to be running Skirmishers for 5% crit chance. We're going to be running Bone Mages for a 25% damage multiplier. And then we're going to be running Golem for a 30% crit damage multiplier. And remember, with the Aspect of Grasping Veins plus the 5% from Skirmishers, our crit chance gets pretty damn high, so a 30% multiplier on that ends up being a lot of damage, especially when you crit and overpower. It's a ludicrous amount of damage. Let's talk about the Construct next. So the Construct, this is going to look pretty standard. You know, the Construct has become pretty normalized for Necro builds. We're going to be running Flash of Adrenaline with Genesis, Duration, and Tactical Support, which is going to give us 100% uptime on a 50% damage buff. And then we're going to be running Tempest with Evernight for the +4 to all skills, Safeguard support for 15% damage reduction, and Resource support for the resource generation. This setup is what I would definitely suggest. I wouldn't really make any changes. You can technically replace Safeguard support with the Fortified generation, but I think Safeguard is a lot better. Next, let's talk about the Paragon board, and then we're going to get into a couple of tips and tricks so that you can play this build at the peak level it can perform at. So, starting here, we're going to be taking Essence for a 22% damage multiplier against enemies that aren't healthy. Now, we have a ton of crit, right? And so we're able to proc this a lot, but this isn't really going to help us in AoE so much as it's going to help us against bosses, but our AoE damage is so high that it's worth taking. We're taking Control for a 20% damage multiplier in AoE, so every time our Corpse Tendrils procs and CCs the enemies, we're going to get 20% damage, which is a lot. Then we're going to be taking Bloodbath for a 35% multiplier on Overpower. Coming up here, we're going to be taking Scent of Death. Scent of Death is either 15% damage or 15% damage reduction. Both are very good, so we're happy with this. And then we're going to be running Corporeal. So it's important to run Corporeal here, so it's hitting these armor nodes, and it's going to give us a 10% physical damage increase, which happens to be what Bloodlands does. Coming over here, we're going to be taking Blood Begets Blood for a 5% damage increase every time we pick up a Blood Orb, up to 15%. Obviously, with how many Blood Orbs we're generating, this is very good. And then we're going to be taking Dominate for a massive Overpower additive damage increase, as well as a huge multiplier of 12%. Now, keep in mind, we're usually just going to be one-shotting stuff when we overpower anyway, so the 12% isn't as significant. But if anything is tanky enough to live, it will die immediately after being overpowered because we get this extra 12%. That is a ton of damage, and the flat damage from Overpower here is just ludicrous, the additive damage. Coming over here, we're going to be taking Flesh Eater. So remember the Sacrilege, auto-casting Corpse Explosions, right? This has become pretty standard. So we get 40% damage every 5 seconds, and it lasts for 6 seconds. Pretty damn good. And then we're going to be taking Sacrificial here for 10% increased damage, as well as a buff to the magic nodes. And remember, these magic nodes are resistances. So it's very important that we hit this so that we can get to our res cap, and you can start to see how this is all working. So you can see how we're getting to res cap, you can see how we're getting so much armor, and hopefully after this you can see how much damage we're able to do. Now let's get into the tips and tricks, and let's talk about a couple of things you can do to make the build work even better. The first tip is to keep up the Decrepify as much as you can. You can see here that I'm already at a 26% damage reduction from Decrepify, and that's not even including the damage reduction from my pants and the extra 4 ranks of Decrepify I get from the pet. So this is a ton of damage reduction. On top of that, it's also going to be a 70% damage multiplier because of our pants, and it's going to reduce the cooldown on all of our skills, so it's very important. The other thing is that it's very important to keep up Bone Storm. Especially if you're running Lidless Wall, you need to quickly move from pack to pack and keep hitting enemies so that your Bone Storm stays up. Sometimes it can be hard to keep up that pace, but you gotta figure out how to do it. The other tip I'll have is to always make sure when you get to a pack to use Reap, so that you can spawn a corpse, and then your Sacrilege will automatically cast Corpse Tendrils, allowing you to group enemies to do massive damage to them. So it's really important to go into a pack and Reap at the start of it to make sure that you can get that corpse. And as part of that, make sure that you're using Corpse Tendrils on CD for the increased damage. So the main tip here is mostly just keep all of your buffs up and running, make sure you don't drop stuff, and just hold down Bloodlance and kill everything as long as you're ramped. So that's going to do it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if I'm too ugly for the camera. I'll stop using it. But yeah, hopefully you guys liked the video. Let me know in the comments how you felt about it. And if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a subscribe. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.